Good evening, everyone. I'm Bill Brown at Brookings Mountain West. Thanks for coming out on what I classify as a dark, cold night in Las Vegas. That may be an appropriate omen for our talk tonight. We'll have to see. We're going to talk about U.S. Russia relations going forward, and we try and bring you timely talks. So when we thought about this, we thought it would be a great time to look at some post-election, look at foreign policy. But I think we're also going to have to look at some domestic policy, given what's happened in the last few weeks and accusations going back and forth. We're thrilled to have our colleague Stephen Pifer out from the Brookings Institution. Stephen has a distinguished career in the Foreign Service, including a term as ambassador in the Ukraine. He's lived and worked and served the country around the globe. He's now bringing that knowledge and expertise to Brookings, where he's lecturing and publishing on foreign policy, nuclear disarmament, and related topics. But he has unique experience and insight in this part of the world. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to give his insights on this topic. And as always, we'll have time at the end for some Q&A. Stephen? Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. When Donald Trump takes office in January, he's going to have a very busy inbox, and it's going to include a lot of foreign policy issues. And one of the most consequential relationships he's going to have to deal with is that with Russia. Now, most analysts would say Russia is a power in decline, but it still is unique in that it is the one country in the world that could physically destroy the United States. And there are a lot of issues on which American and Russian interests intersect, sometimes where we cooperate, sometimes where we confront one another. Now, back in 2009, when he took office, President Obama launched a reset. And it actually generated quite a bit of success and progress in the first couple of years. But by the second term, it ran into some trouble. And particularly after Russian military action against Ukraine, we've seen the U.S.-Russia relationship at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War. Now, one thing, if you look at the U.S.-Russia relationship over the last 25 years, it kind of goes in cycles. And there tends to be an uptick when you have a new leader in one of the capitals, and we'll have a new leader in Washington in 2 months. So one of the things I'll talk about tonight are what are the prospects for a new reset in 2017. But what I plan to do is I'll break my talk down into 4 pieces. First, I'll talk about how did we get here? What happened with the Obama reset over the last 8 years. Second, I'll talk a little bit about what are some of the issues that motivate Russian policy, because we have to understand what drives their foreign policy if we're going to figure out how we can shape it. Third, I'll talk about what are the key issues on the agenda. And then last, I'll come back and say, what are the chances that there might be a new reset in 2017? So let me begin with a little bit of history. When Barack Obama came to the White House back in 2009, at that time, most analysts were saying this is the low point in U.S.-Russia relations since the end of the Cold War. You had strong disagreement, the Russians unhappy about American plans to deploy missile defense interceptors in Poland. The Russians were unhappy that at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, NATO was talking about membership action plans for Ukraine and Georgia, countries that the Russians regarded as in their sphere of influence. And then you had in August of 2008, the Russian-Georgian conflict. Now, when Mr. Obama came to office and launched the reset, they were actually pretty clear what they were trying to attempt. It was not to get the U.S. relationship with Russia to nirvana, but it was a calculation that on certain things that the Obama administration wanted to achieve, Russian help would be useful. So for example, within a couple of months after he takes office, the president goes to Prague and gives a speech where he talks about nuclear weapons and creating a world in which you could envisage a world with conditions where you didn't have nuclear weapons. He talked about reducing the role and number. Russia has to be involved in that. He wanted to put more pressure on Iran to stop the Iranian nuclear program. Russian help could be valuable there. And at that time in 2008, 2009, you had 100,000 American and NATO troops in Afghanistan. And 100,000 troops consume a lot of food, ammunition, fuel, equipment. And all of that stuff was going on land through Pakistan. And every time you had a blip in U.S.-Pakistani relations, the Pakistanis shut the supply line down. So can you find another way to get to Afghanistan? And so these were areas where the Obama administration said, these are important things for the American foreign policy interest. Can we get Russian help? And that's what launched the reset. And actually, it made some very early progress. First of all, because at the time, the president wasn't Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin had served 2 terms as president, but in early 2008 had stepped down because the Russian constitution says 2 consecutive terms and then you have to step down. Now it's kind of interesting, he stepped down and nominated his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, to become president. Mr. Medvedev was elected and then promptly appointed Mr. Putin as prime minister. Now most people understood that the real power then shifted from the presidency to the prime minister. The American embassy in Moscow famously referred to Medvedev as Robin to Putin's Batman, and I think that describes the relationship. But that said, Obama and Medvedev hit it off. Similar generation, both lawyers, both thinking kind of in new terms, post-Cold War terms. And they had some early progress to record. So within a month or 2 after they first meet in April of 2009, we've launched negotiations with the Russians on reducing strategic arms. And one of the first things the US delegation says is, we're going to go back to the traditional approach. We're going to look at a limitation that applies not just to warheads, but also to missiles and bombers. And that was a change from the Bush administration, which wanted to limit only warheads. The Russians were much more comfortable with the traditional approach, so that was a plus early on. And then later on, the Russians begin to make some offers on access to Afghanistan. And right before Obama had his first meeting with Medvedev in April of 2009, there was some evidence suggesting that the Russians were trying to close an American air base in Kyrgyzstan, a place called Manas. Reportedly, when the president met with Medvedev, he said, I don't get it. He says, what do we do at Manas? We fly in American troops. It's a chance for them to have a hot shower, a hot meal. Then they go to Afghanistan and they go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, people who had just as happily killed Russians as Americans. Why are you trying to frustrate this? And when Obama goes to Moscow in July, the Russians are all of a sudden very helpful on access to Afghanistan, offering the ability to move lethal equipment on the ground through Russia and allow direct American overflights across Russia into Central Asia and into Afghanistan. So they make the logistics problem much easier. At that same meeting, the 2 presidents issued guidelines for the New START treaty that talks about limits, talks about how they're going to go forward, and defines really the issues that need to be resolved to bring that treaty to conclusion. At that point in time, you've also got the prospects for doing more. So by a year and a half later, or a year and 3 months later, by the fall of 2010, there's a pretty good record of U.S. Russian cooperation. Obama and Medvedev have signed the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty that by February of 2018 will reduce each side to no more than 1,550 deployed warheads on no more than 700 deployed missiles and bombers. That's a lot, but the START 1 treaty allowed each side 6,000 warheads on 1,600 missiles and bombers. Moreover, the Obama administration changed the missile defense plans in Europe that the Russians had not liked and came up with a new plan that the Russians seemed to be more interested in. There was actually a dialogue launched between NATO and Russia. Can we actually develop a cooperative NATO-Russia missile defense where we're working together to provide protection for Europe against missile attack? As I said, by that time in the fall of 2010, you have lots of American equipment flowing through Russia or in the airspace over Russia into Afghanistan. The logistics problem has become much easier. And Russia has become very helpful on the Iran's arms embargo. In the summer of 2010 at the UN Security Council, the Russians agree to a UN Security Council resolution that imposes an arms embargo on Iran. Now, at that point in time, the biggest sale that was pending was a sale by Russia to Iran of the S-300 anti-aircraft system, causing concern to both American and Israeli Air Force people who were contemplating what would happen if there would have to be military action against Iran. And I remember talking to people at the White House, and there was a little bit of ambiguity in the language. And I said, does this embargo include defensive surface-to-air missiles? And they said, you know, we hope so. But if the Russians go ahead with that sale, we won't scream foul. 2 months later in September, the Russians announced they're canceling the sale and bringing an Iranian delegation to Moscow to negotiate a return of the down payment. So by the end of 2010, a lot's going on in a positive way. The United States is working with Russia to help them get into the World Trade Organization, and that's probably the height of the reset. Things begin to slow down a little bit in 2011. First of all, although the Obama administration wants to go further on nuclear arms cuts, the Russians say, not interested. We want to tackle other questions first. And at the top of this is missile defense. And here, missile defense begins to go sour. After 4 or 5 months of pretty positive talks where it sounds like the sides are getting close on what might a cooperative missile defense freeup look like, it breaks down. And the Russians begin to escalate their criticism of missile defense. On another issue, Libya, there's a desire by some European powers to take action against Gaddafi. The US government supports that. President Medvedev agrees not to block a UN Security Council resolution that would allow basically a no-fly zone over Libya. And there's a no-fly zone prosecuted in a very aggressive way, which the Russians, particularly Putin, say is, wait, you really stretched beyond this, particularly when it results in the death of Gaddafi. So you're beginning to see bumps in the first half of 2011, and then you get into the presidential election season. In September of 2011, at a party congress of the United Russia, President Medvedev comes out and says, I think for the election next year, we ought to nominate Vladimir Putin to be president. And Mr. Putin says, well, good idea. And when I'm president, I think I'll make Mr. Medvedev prime minister. So we're going to switch jobs. The election was pretty much configured at that point. I think no one really had, much suspense about how it was going to turn out. But in this campaign, Mr. Putin ran a campaign that had a fairly strong anti-American tinge. You also have the presidential election going on in the United States, and it's pretty clear the Obama administration doesn't really want to have big Russia initiatives or big arms control initiatives because they don't play well domestically in terms of domestic politics. So there's that lost year of 2012 while elections kind of have both sides cool it. In the beginning of 2013, when you talk to people in the Obama administration, they say, look, we're not going to do a new reset, but we have the elections behind us. Let's see if we can move forward. And the issues that they talked to the Russians about, and they had an agreed agenda in 2013. We're going to talk about further nuclear arms reductions. Let's go back and look at missile defense and see if we can find a way to come to terms and overcome our differences. And then let's talk about expanding the economics of the relationship. And that's a big question, because if you look at the U.S. Trade relationship with Russia, it ranks there about with the U.S. trade relationship with Costa Rica. And that has a cost, because you don't have economics in a situation where it's going to level or stabilize the relationship. And compare that with China, where the U.S.-China trade relationship is $500 to $600 billion a year. So both in Beijing and Washington, when you're having political tensions, you're also saying, wait, we need to be a bit careful here because there's some real money at stake. You don't have that between the United States and Russia. So one of the ideas is, can we talk about developing that economic relationship? And in the spring of 2013, they say President Obama is going to go to Moscow in September, summit, and we'll see what we can do on these issues. But by early summer, what you're hearing is that on all three issues, from the American point of view, nothing's happening. The Americans put forward some ideas on missile defense, on nuclear reductions. The Russians just don't engage. And then you have Mr. Snowden goes to Moscow. Whatever people think about what Mr. Snowden did in terms of revealing NSA abuses here in the United States, the Russians were very clear. This guy's a defector. I think the State Department was a little bit naive in saying, we want the Russians to send Snowden back. Vladimir Putin, spent his career as a professional intelligence officer. He understands the first time you send a defector back to the country from which that defector came, that's the last time you're ever going to get a defector from that country. It's just not going to happen. Now, I think the press misread it in August 2013 when the Obama administration canceled the Moscow summit. They thought it was all about Snowden, and I think that's incorrect. It was more about the fact that on the issues of arms control reductions, missile defense, economics, going to Moscow was not going to produce any progress. And I had the impression from talking to people that they were prepared to do that and take the heat. Well, how can you be in Moscow when Snowden's there, if they could have something to show for it? But they didn't see any possibility. So in the fall of 2013, the view of the Obama administration is, well, we're just going to manage this relationship. We have no big expectations. But then the crash comes in 2014, and it comes when the Russians take military action after the Maidan Revolution. First of all, the illegal seizure and annexation of Crimea, and then support for separatism in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, which now has resulted in the death of almost 10,000 people. And that really kind of leads to a crash in U.S.-Russia relations. And one question, why should we care about Ukraine? And because I had a hand in this, I go back to 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had on its territory 2,000 strategic warheads targeted at the United States. It was the third largest nuclear power in the world. And with a lot of effort by the United States, we persuaded Ukraine to get rid of those nuclear weapons. But a big part of the package of that was the Budapest Memorandum, in which the United States, Russia, and Britain agreed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, agreed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. And all those commitments have been grossly violated by the Russians, and there's a certain obligation on the United States, I believe, to support Ukraine. But that brings the relationship to a low point, and then of course you have Syria. And there's been a very valiant effort over the last year and a half by Secretary Kerry to find some kind of common ground with the Russians on Syria, but it's been frustrated by the fact that Washington and Moscow have very different goals. The Washington objective in Syria is to go after ISIS and to get Assad out, who's responsible for the death of tens of thousands of Syrians and millions of refugees. The Russians went into Syria militarily in September of 2015, primarily to bolster Assad. So it's hard to see where you're going to find common ground there. On top of that, you have, and I think people are now speaking increasingly openly, there's a hybrid war campaign or hybrid conflict being conducted by Russia against the West. You see an information war in terms of what Sputnik and RT, both propaganda arms of the Kremlin, put out on television in the West. You see it in cyber war. I mean, as was stated by American intelligence community, the leak of the DNC emails was provided by Russian intelligence. So there's that little bit of conflict going on. And so you now have a relationship which ends up at a low point. The history, though, is kind of interesting. If you go back and you look at the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration, the first terms seemed to be pretty good. Each achieved some progress with Russia in that first term. It was in the second term, though, however, when things crashed and got more difficult. So let me turn now and talk a little bit about what drives Russian policy. And certainly there's sort of the traditional national security, to security questions, access to trade, access to resources. But more so than I think in many countries, Russian foreign policy today is driven by domestic factors. And I'll give you one big example. If you look at the Kremlin, most analysts, or many analysts would say, for the Kremlin right now, preservation of the regime is job number one. And how do you justify the regime to the Russian people? From 2000 to 2008, it was based on economics. And you'd talk to Russians, and Russians would say, Mr. Putin has an implicit social contract with the Russian people, in which he says, you're not going to have any political authority. You'll have no political voice. But you're going to have economic stability, security. You're going to see the economy grow and your living standards go up. And Mr. Putin came into office in 2000 at the right time because the price of oil jumped up, and all of a sudden there's a lot of money flowing into Russia. And the Russian economy from 2000 to 2008 is growing 7 to 8% a year. And you see a middle class develop. People are traveling, they're going to Turkey for vacation, they're buying new cars. It's a very positive time economically. When Mr. Putin comes back to the presidency in 2012, however, the economic situation is much more grim. And he doesn't talk about economics. And instead, and we saw this in his presidential re-election campaign in 2011, it's based on Russian nationalism, it's based on Russia as a great power, Russia reasserting itself on the world stage. And a lot of what Russia is doing in Ukraine and Syria now, I believe, is driven by the effort of the Kremlin to say to the Russian people, Russia's great, Russia's back again. And that plays well with a major portion of Mr. Putin's constituency at home. And that great power pitch has a very strong anti-American tinge. Another thing that we have to bear in mind is that Mr. Putin has a sense of grievance. He looks back at the last 25 years and says, the West took advantage of Russian weakness. And he looks at things like NATO enlargement and the enlargement of the European Union, and he doesn't see those driven by countries in Central Europe after they break out of the Warsaw Pact saying, we want to be full members of institutional Europe. But it's an American, German, British plot to hem in Russia. Now, I think his history is wrong. I spent 2.5 years at the Clinton White House, and President Clinton really wanted to build a Russia-NATO relationship so that the Russians wouldn't care about NATO enlargement. But I don't think we're going to be able to change Mr. Putin's perception, and that perception drives his policy. So there are a couple of factors behind Russian policy. They're the domestic political factor in Moscow, and then Mr. Putin's own perception. That's going to be very difficult for us to change and shape, and that's going to make it hard for the West to deal with Russia. I'd offer, I guess, 2 other comments just looking at Moscow. First, one is Mr. Putin is probably the most powerful Russian leader or Soviet leader going back to Stalin. And there's not really the check and balance that you had for a good part of the Soviet period. There's no Politburo. So in 1964, the Politburo basically fired Nikita Khrushchev. There isn't that kind of group in the Kremlin today that could fire Putin. Now, if Putin were to step off the curb in the wrong time and get run over by a bus, I'm not sure who comes in. My guess is it's someone, though, who looks a lot like Putin, not a Mikhail Gorbachev. So we need to be thinking about dealing with the approach, and we probably shouldn't personalize it too much about Putin, but the kind of line in Moscow that we're seeing now, that's the kind of Russia we're probably going to have to deal with for the next 5 to 7 years. And so how do we shape that? The second point to make about Russia is that Russia, I believe, is a declining power. The demographics are horrible. The population is now about 143 million, but some estimates say by 2050 that'll be down to maybe 130, 120 million. Moreover, the economy is stagnant. I mean, does anybody here own a Russian car or a Russian computer or a Russian television or Russian clothes? Didn't think so. Oh, okay, well, one. Okay, close. But for the most part, other than weapons, tanks and fighter planes, Russia doesn't build much that the world wants to buy. And this is actually, I think, a pretty big difference between Putin and Medvedev. Medvedev gets this. Medvedev understands this, but really hasn't been able to change some things. And there seems to be some nervousness in Moscow that real economic reform means opening up the political space in a way that they're just not comfortable with. And so it's not clear that Russia is going to change off of this trajectory. And what they're putting in place really is not a recipe for success in the 21st century. So I think we're talking about a state in decline, but it's still a state that can make a lot of mischief in the meantime. So let me talk a bit about what are the key questions on the U.S.-Russia agenda. And I'll start by saying that the relationship is now, and it's going to be a mix of issues where we cooperate and issues where we're going to be confronting one another. And that's a reflection of the fact that there are 2 large countries which interact on a lot of different questions. And sometimes I think it's hard for Americans. We want to categorize a country, you're either a friend or you're an enemy. And it's more difficult for us to deal with a country where we have to do both cooperation, but also we have to push back on. But on the cooperative issues, I'd name a couple. I think nuclear arms reductions may be one where the sides have an interest in working together. There is one problem we're going to have to work out, which is the Russian violation of the 1987 treaty that banned ground-based intermediate-range missiles. I don't think we can go further on nuclear arms reductions if we can't solve that problem, because there's no way the American Senate would ratify a new treaty. But looking ahead, you can see some possible ways to bridge the differences between the American desire for more reductions and the Russian desire to solve missile defense and some other questions. There may be some way to bridge those differences. The sides have a joint interest in working to contain the Iranian nuclear program. They've cooperated on one aspect successfully on Syria, which is the elimination of most of Syria's chemical weapons. And they share an interest in trying to stop the North Korean nuclear program, although Russia really is sort of a minor player in that question. So there's some pretty important issues where Washington and Moscow have an interest in cooperation. But there's also some big issues where they're going to be adversaries. Ukraine. It's pretty clear that even though Russia participated in the negotiation of a settlement for the conflict in eastern Ukraine about almost 2 years ago, the Russians really haven't moved to implement that agreement. And it looks like the Russians want a simmering conflict in eastern Ukraine as a way to put pressure on the government in Kyiv and make it more difficult for that government to do things that it needs to do, like reform. And that's going to be an issue. There's also the issue of the illegal seizure of Crimea, which was the most blatant land grab in Europe since the end of the World War II. And my guess is there'll be an American policy, or there should be an American policy of non-recognition that goes quite far into the future on that. Missile defense is going to be a problem. And it's interesting, it was a problem in the second term of the Clinton administration, it was a problem in the second term of the Bush administration, it was a problem in the second term of the Obama administration. And can we figure out a way to manage missile defense where we can remove it as a problem question on the agenda? There's also going to be this question of what does Europe look like? And two very different views. Washington's view being, NATO enlargement, European Union enlargement is actually good in terms of building a more unified Europe and a transatlantic community, against a Russian view, which is that no, there should be a Russian sphere of influence, and institutions such as the European Union should not intrude into the former Soviet space. And that Russian view basically says, though, countries like Ukraine, Georgia, really shouldn't have a free right to determine how they want to align themselves. And that's going to be an issue of contention. And then there'll be Syria. And it's hard for me to see how we reach a cooperative approach on Syria, but particularly with the new administration, I think the new administration is first going to have to work out what's its policy on Syria. Before we talk to the Russians about Syria, we need to decide what we ourselves want from Syria and what we're prepared to do to achieve that goal. So let me now turn to the last part, what's the possibility of a reset in 2017? And when I started thinking about this talk, it was at the end of October. It was before November 8th. I'll be honest, I did not expect the outcome on November 8th that actually occurred. I thought I'd be writing this for President-elect Clinton. And so when I was thinking it through at that time, I said, well, what should the American policy approach to Russia be? And what would be the pieces? One piece would be to hold the door open to dialogue, discussing issues, but also making clear that it would be hard to get back to a more normal relationship, a more positive relationship, unless there were certain corrections to Russian behavior that's been pretty problematic. It would be support for Ukraine to continue to help that state resist Russian pressure. It would be taking some steps in NATO, basically that NATO's already laid out, to increase its conventional deterrence and defense capabilities. In particular, I worry about the Baltic states. I don't think a Russian attack on the Baltic states is high probability. It's very, very low. But if we were doing this 5 years ago, I would tell you that probability is zero. And I want to make sure that line between Baltic territory and Russian territory is very clear, very bright, and very red. We need to figure out how we're going to deal with this hybrid conflict. How do we deal with Russian cyber conflict? How do we deal with an information war when we also want to keep an open media society? And that's going to be a difficult question. And then again, while keeping pressure on the Russians, also leaving the door open for changes if Russia's prepared to change. And then hopefully maybe looking at some new steps that we could do in the arms control world simply to regulate the competition. The New START Treaty is much more important today than when it was signed in 2010, because as the relationship gets more difficult, both sides appreciate the fact that you have a cap on the other side's strategic forces, and that also the treaty, which provides for notifications and data exchanges and inspections, you also know a lot more about the other side's nuclear forces, so you don't have to make worst case assumptions. So that would have meant for a Clinton administration, no real reset, but basically defining a policy. And as the Russians came to understand what the contours of that policy would be, I think there was a chance the Russians would be prepared to deal. But the key points were going to be patient, persistent, and be consistent. So that the Russians understand where the red lines are, where there's some openings, and then you can shape things. Now that was a part of the talk I'd written, as I said before November 8, I had to kind of scribble down some additional thoughts because we now have President-elect Trump. And like most of my colleagues at Brookings in the foreign policy program, we feel like we're all on very unknown ground here. He suggested some things during the campaign that would amount to a radical change in the American approach towards Europe. For example, the press talked about the Putin-Trump bromance. He talked about better relations with Russia, which I would agree with, but he talked about improving relations with Russia without seeming to ask for any correction by the Russians of the problematic behavior that, in fact, brought West Russian relations to this low point. He questioned support for Ukraine, suggested he might be prepared to recognize Crimea's annexation by Russia. He questioned whether we should maintain economic sanctions on Russia that are a result of that were applied after Russia annexed Crimea and then also launched military action against the Donbass. And he's also questioned the terms of NATO and said, maybe NATO's obsolete, or are we really prepared to defend allies which in his view have not carried out their part of the bargain, have not contributed enough to their own defense. And if you take all that together, that's a huge that's a reset. But it's a reset that departs against the American approach to Europe that goes back probably to Harry Truman. And I think it would be a profound mistake. But I'm not sure we're going there. And I hesitate to make predictions, in part because if you'd asked me in August of 2015 about Mr. Trump, I said, he'll be out of the race by November, it can't happen. And so here we are. So let me give you not a prediction, but let me give you two scenarios which define a spectrum of what I would expect to see in terms of how a Trump administration will approach Russia. Scenario one, which is the one I personally am hoping for, is that if you look at the Republican mainstream in Congress, if you look at Vice President-elect Pence, if you look at all the names that we're now hearing about who might be Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, all of those people hold traditional Republican views about Europe. They support NATO, they support Ukraine. In fact, the Republicans have been pushing for 2 years for the Obama administration to provide lethal military assistance to Ukraine, to provide more sanctions on Russia. And that Republican mainstream is also pretty wary, pretty suspicious of Russia. And so if Mr. Trump, puts those people into the cabinet, if he listens to that advice, if he heeds that advice, you'll see some changes from the Obama policy, but it's not going to be dramatic. And again, if there's a consistency to that policy, my guess is after a while the Russians will begin to look at ways where they can accommodate themselves to the American position. There's another point that leads me a little bit more to that first scenario, which is Mr. Trump talks about he wants to do deals. It's not clear to me what the deal is he does with Vladimir Putin, because if you look over the last year, Mr. Putin has been very clear about what he wants. He wants basically a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. He wants NATO and European Union to stop and maybe even draw back. He wants a free hand in Syria. He has a long list of what he wants. The list on the other side about what he's prepared to give is pretty blank. So I'm not sure that there's a basis for a big deal with Russia. So that's scenario one. Now, scenario two is that Mr. Trump doesn't listen to the Republican mainstream. Here's somebody who became president in many cases by not listening to the advice of professional election advisors. So maybe he decides to run his foreign policy as he ran his campaign. He goes with his gut, he goes with instinct. And in that case, my guess is you can see some really big changes in how the United States deals with Europe. And I think those changes could have some fairly dramatic and fairly negative consequences. First of all, if the sanctions fall away from Russia, if we recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea, does the Kremlin conclude this worked at relatively low cost, and is the Kremlin then emboldened to try some things elsewhere? Second, you're going to have allies in the Baltic states, Poland, and Central Europe who are going to be horribly nervous about what happens next. What does Russia do if it looks like the United States is backing off? And then more broadly, does Europe think, well, if we don't have the transatlantic connections, if we have an American first policy that doesn't pay much attention to institutions such as NATO, do we need to reach an accommodation with Russia? And I worry that those sorts of concerns lead to changes in the European policy that are going to result in a transatlantic relationship that is much less than we've had in the last 60 years and will be in a way that will be very damaging to American security interests. So I'll close by saying I'm hoping for that edge of the spectrum. I worry that we may end in for the second end of the spectrum, and it's probably going to come out somewhere between, whether it's close to the optimistic scenario or the more difficult scenario. We'll begin to find out in about 2 months' time. So why don't I stop at that point, and I'll be happy to take questions. Please.
Yes, in the two things that kind of I'm very interested in on our sort of in the economic areas. One thing is the situation with natural gas, and I know that they produce just from free-flowing natural gas. They really basically turn down fracking, and there's some issues there with how much they give to Europe or sell. Are they going to hold it up? The other thing that changed, I think, this last year and a half, Russia is trying to open up major Arctic shipping from Europe across to Russia and down now. And I think that could have big impacts in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
but anyway.
Yeah, well, 2 points. I mean, I'll start with the second point. No, I mean, I think with the collapse of Arctic sea ice, people are now looking very much at that shipping lane, and the Russians are very interested in that, and the Russians are also very interested in maintaining security now in that environment if it becomes more accessible. On the gas situation, there have been some really interesting changes. I mean, first of all, the long-term change for the United States has been the discovery of unconventional gas here. Where I can remember back in 2000, everyone saying, where are we going to get our gas? We're going to have to import huge amounts of gas from the Middle East, and now that's all fallen by the wayside. The Russians have seen some interesting changes in gas, I mean, in part because in 2006 and 2009, because of gas disputes with Ukraine, they ended up cutting off gas to Ukraine, but the pipelines that move Russian gas into Ukraine are the same pipelines that move Russian gas through Ukraine into Germany, the Czech Republic, Italy, places like that. And a funny thing happened. The Russians say, well, we're going to turn the gas off to Ukraine. And what they noticed was all of a sudden no gas came out the other side of Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainians just used it. So they ended up shutting down the whole network. And that caused several impacts. First of all, the Ukrainians got much more serious about gas conservation. And in fact, they've cut their gas consumption now to about half of what it was when I was there in the 1990s. The Russians began to build pipelines around Ukraine. And the Europeans said, we can't be confident in Russia as a reliable gas supplier. So you've seen a lot of construction of LNG terminals, a lot of which are not being used, but they're there in reserve. And to the point where a lot of Europe now, if the Russians were to turn the gas off, it would be more expensive. But the Europeans, with the exception of some countries in Central Europe, could largely replace that gas by bringing in LNG from the Middle East. And that LNG, which was really supposed to go to the United States, but since we don't need it, it's looking for a place to go. So it's had some very interesting impacts, and the gas situation for Russia now is a bit more complicated and a bit less straightforward than it was, say, 5 to 7 years ago. Yes?
Given Russia's views on NATO as an organization, what do you see the future of Russian-Turkish relations, given the recent energy deal and what happened as a response to the shoot-down in Syria last year?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's been a really fascinating relationship to watch because you had for several years prior to the shoot-down, the Russians and the Turks really beginning to build quite a relationship, and a lot of suspicion of the Russians trying to basically pull Turkey out of NATO. Part of that, I think, was the Turks' frustration with the European Union, is the Turks have been applying to the European Union since the 1960s, and there really is, I mean, there's no visible prospect, and so I think there's a certain frustration in that. You then, though, had Russian-Turkish differences emerge over Syria. I mean, the Turks are very much of the view that Assad needs to go. And then you had that shoot-down. And I think that the shoot-down was interesting. I mean, there was no way that was an accident. There was a direct order to shoot the plane down, in part because prior to that shoot-down, you'd had a number of instances where Russian planes flew into Turkish airspace and didn't seem to take it seriously. And I think the Turks just made a decision, no, we're going to show them that we're serious. That led to a total crash in Russian-Turkish relations, and the Turks basically encountered a certain amount of economic pressure because the Russians cut off both trade but also cut off the flow of tourists to Turkey. And so they're now trying to patch things up. We'll see how much that can recover. I mean, there still are some issues that they differ on, such as Syria and such. And the Turks are still going to have to consider how close they want to get to Russia vis-a-vis the kind of ties they want to maintain with Europe and the West. Yes?
Can you discuss corruption in the Ukraine and the effect on stability in the country?
Yeah, it's huge, and it's had a really negative impact. I mean, one of the reasons why in 2014 Ukraine was so weak and fragile and so it was vulnerable to the Russian pressure, why it really couldn't resist the seizure of Crimea or what happened in the Donbass was, this was a state that had way underperformed in economic terms, and a lot of that was due to corruption. And there were just schemes. The gas industry, for example. The Ukrainian government never wanted to raise the price of gas that was used in heat and energy for households. So they didn't for 20 years. Only in the last couple of years did they do the raises. And so 4 or 5 years ago, people would say a household in Ukraine is paying about a fifth of the cost of the energy that it's getting for heating purposes. In order to make that work, the Ukrainian government held down the price it would pay for gas produced within Ukraine. So there was no incentive to produce new gas in Ukraine. And then you also created this wonderful opportunity, if you had if you had a connection to the presidential administration, and you could arrange to buy some of that cheap domestic gas, and then turn around and sell it either at the industrial rate in Ukraine, or better yet, export it to Europe. Instant triple, quadruple, quintuple your profits. I mean, and so those people who had access, and the cost to the Ukrainian government was, Anders Alsson is a very good economist, estimates that Ukraine's government, the cost of subsidizing that gas amounted to about 6 to 8% of the gross domestic product. Yeah, you do that and your economy is not going to work. And it's things like that and the corruption and the resistance of oligarchs and others who profited from those sorts of schemes, who resisted creating a more open, productive economy that held Ukraine back. And one of the reasons why they were so weak when it came to 2014 was precisely because of that. They're making some progress now, but I think there's still some questions, even the current government, whether they're really prepared to take on corruption in a serious way. There's a lot of unhappiness in Ukraine that you haven't seen any officials arrested or any officials of note. There's been really not a lot of effort to go after the people in the previous government. President Yanukovych, by some counts, stole billions of dollars, and they can't track that down. And it really, I think, has had an extremely negative impact on Ukraine's development and on its ability to become a more normal European state.
Did the onset of the annexation of Crimea come as a surprise to you personally, and do you feel that the Obama administration responded to it properly?
Now, a colleague of mine, Fiona Hill, who I think has written the best book ever on Putin, we put out a paper in January of 2014, and we said the Russians are really unhappy about Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova getting too close to European institutions. And after the Sochi Olympics, they're going to move to settle scores. Now, what I thought it was going to be, I thought it was going to be economic pressure on Ukraine. They might cut off the gas. We said small possibility of military action, but that was seen. I think most people were really surprised. They expected there would be Russian pressure on Ukraine. But after you had Yanukovych fled Kyiv and the appointment of a government that was very much saying its first foreign policy priority is to draw closer to the European Union, I think the Kremlin kind of panicked, and then they seized Crimea in a way that I think surprised most people. The U.S. government, from what I understand, basically told the Ukrainians, stay calm. And on Crimea, there were about 10,000 Ukrainian troops. They largely stayed in garrison and did not resist. And that was a combination not just of Western advice, but I think the Ukrainians were really of a mind, if there's going to be a shooting war, we want the Russians to fire the first shot. And there was also probably a question, since in the Ukrainian military structure, most of your troops are drawn locally. I think a lot of the Ukrainian commanders were not totally confident in how their troops, many of whom were ethnic Russians from Crimea, would perform. Then, of course, you had the conflict in the Donbass. But within about 2 weeks of the Russian seizure of Crimea, you had the first set of sanctions that were applied and are specifically linked to Crimea. The focus then began to shift more to what was going on in eastern Ukraine, because that was the hot war. Crimea was basically taken with very few, if any, casualties. And as I said, in the 2.5 years of the fighting in Donbass, nearly 10,000 people have been killed. So Crimea it's kind of on the back burner. It's the problem for tomorrow because the focus has been trying to shape and stop the fighting in the Donbass and implement a peace settlement there. And then the bulk of American sanctions since June, July of 2014 have been linked to the Donbass. My guess is if you get a settlement on the Donbass, which is not likely but not totally excluded, at that point a lot of the American sanctions on Russia will come off. But you're still going to see sanctions that will apply to Crimea for a long time to come. Things like American ships won't be allowed to call at Crimean ports. American planes won't be able to go there. If somebody from Crimea goes to Moscow and goes to the embassy and says, I want a visa to go to the United States, they're going to be told, no, you're actually Ukrainian, go to the embassy in Kyiv. And we know how to do non-recognition. I mean, we did it for 5 decades with regards to the Baltic states and their incorporation in the Soviet Union. So I think those sanctions will play on. Whether they will have an impact, it's very hard analytically for me to see how Ukraine musters the leverage to get Crimea back. But that's an analytical judgment. I think policy terms, the right course is simply not to recognize it and maintain a certain set of sanctions that are linked to Crimea. Yes.
Thanks, first of all, for a really enlightening discussion. I found this really useful. I want to maybe follow up on the discussion about Turkey. And you mentioned Syria, of course, that one needs to, I suppose, develop a position on Syria before one goes to Russia and to some degree. And the European Union has come up in others. So I'm wondering about these sort of third players. I mean, there's the bilateral relationship, but then you have these third players. And maybe the way, of course, one could talk about this for hours, but maybe one of the ways to ask this question is to ask about, for lack of a better term or expression, the march of illiberalism, which we now have seen basically manifested in this country, but also Bulgaria recently and Moldova as well elected basically pro-Russian presidents. We have Viktor Orban in Hungary. We have Kaczynski in Poland. I mean, this is going further afield, Duterte. I'm wondering how, and of course, Putin himself as being a sort of a principal figure of a kind of in a liberal form of government. How do you see that bilateral relationship developing in the context of what appears to be a kind of disconcerting march of illiberalism, which has implications for the existence of the European Union and so forth and so on? You know where I'm going with this.
No, I think it complicates things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Mr. Putin's probably pretty happy with, Brexit happened, the election of Donald Trump. He's looking to see, will Marine Le Pen win the French election next year? What do populist movements in Europe do? And I think he's thinking the game board's changing in a way that's going to give him more freedom to maneuver. And it's a hard thing for us to do. We're going to have to sort of figure out how do we make Western societies more resilient. There is a risk to liberal democracy, which I think has served the transatlantic community in the West very, very well. But we're going to have to think about how we maintain it and doing it in the context where the Russians from time to time will be interfering. I'm a little bit, I guess, disappointed that there hasn't been more attention, particularly in Congress, to this Russian hack of the DNC emails and that release. I mean, that wasn't a physical attack on the United States. And I actually don't believe that the Russians did that to make Donald Trump president. But I think they did that to make people just kind of doubt the electoral system here, to sow some doubt and some confusion. And that, to my mind, that's outrageous. I mean, that really is sort of striking at the heart of what America's about. And so we have to figure out, how do you respond to that? And because it doesn't use kinetic force, it's not seen as a conflict, but it is a type of conflict. We're going to have to think about what's the clever and right way to respond to that and come up with some ways that basically dissuade Russians from doing things like that in the future.
Maybe the way we're fighting now, I guess.
We'll see. Yes, sir.
What's the evidence that Russia hacked the DNC?
It's when the intelligence community said we are confident. My guess is you and I are never going to see that evidence. But I'll tell you, I mean, the intelligence community as an institution felt horribly burned by what happened in Iraq in 2003, and things have changed, so that they're really, I think, within the intelligence community, they never want to make that mistake again, where they basically feel they were pushed to provide evidence that wasn't really there to justify the Bush administration's decision to go to war. And so I basically believe when they say that. But I think it's also, it's the kind of information that they've acquired through means and techniques that they're not going to want to show to you or show to me, because they worry that if the Russians see that, the Russians find ways to turn it off.
I've always been intrigued by the positioning of Iran and Russia and the center part of Russia. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, part of the thing, Russia's just had a very different relationship with Iran than we have. I mean, they didn't have an embassy seized back in 1979 and hostages held for nearly 2 years. And they've had a more normal relationship with Iran. They've also had, there's a couple other factors at play. One, in Russia, if you're looking at that large amount of space from Syria to India, you know, you've got an ally in Syria, but in the Persian Gulf, you don't really have anybody. I mean, Iran is kind of the only country between India and Syria that the Russians can call a friend. You know, they would like to maybe even think of an ally. So they've worked that relationship. They've had commercial relations. They've provided conventional weapons. They've built the nuclear power plant at Bushehr that we tried to block for a number of years. So there's been that engagement. But they've also, for us, I mean, the nuclear issue is big. And the nightmare scenario for us was Iran with a nuclear weapon. The Russians didn't want to, and the Russians don't want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. But the Russian attitude was different. It was sort of like, well, okay, if they get a nuclear weapon, we'll manage it. Kind of in the same way that the United States responded when Pakistan tested nuclear weapons back in 1998. This is a bad thing, we're going to do some sanctions, but we'll manage it. It's not the end of the world. So there's just been that very different approach the Russians bring. Now, I think the Russians are also nervous, though, about one thing, is that if this Iran deal holds, and I'm not sure that it's going to hold because Mr. Trump has raised questions about it, and that's when where the Republican mainstream probably aligns with him and saying, you know, it's time to undo that deal as opposed to stopping or maintaining the deal. You know, but if that happens, if we can keep the deal in place, does that create an opening for a more improved U.S.-Iranian relationship? And that probably worries Moscow, because at the end of the day, you know, if you look at the young people in Iran, you know, they're not looking at Russia, they're looking at the West. So there's some nervousness that, you know, they could lose Iran at some point down the road.
Thank you for the talk. Thanks for coming. Question about the Europeans' perspective on NATO. So, are they as concerned with Russia as we are? Are they spending more of their GDP on NATO funds, or are they more concerned about refugees? And you know, are there other things bigger on their plate? Is what I'm asking.
No, I think that's a really good question. There's a lot on Europe's plate right now. I mean, 1 million refugees came into Germany in 2015 alone. And how do you handle that? But I think that the Europeans are becoming more concerned about Russia, and so that you have NATO. And I'll go back to, in 2013, it was agreed that there would be a NATO summit in Wales in September of 2014. And 2013, people say, okay, you know, what does that NATO summit do? I mean, the Afghanistan operation is winding down. What's NATO's big role? Well, with the Russian military action against Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, September 2014 was very clear. NATO's role is to go back to the original purpose. It's basically collective defense of the alliance. And so in in Warsaw last summer, NATO leaders met and they made some pretty interesting decisions. One is to deploy NATO battalions in each of the 3 Baltic states and Poland. Now, I think it's a smart decision. It doesn't have a lot of offensive capability, but it does create a situation where the Russians have to understand if you go into Lithuania, you're not just fighting the Lithuanian army, you're going to be fighting Germans and French and Italians and some Americans. And I think that is a pretty powerful deterrent effect. So you're seeing some of that on Europe, particularly in Central Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, they're all, yes, we want to basically do some major steps to upgrade our defense capabilities. In other places, Germany and France, it's coming around, but a little more slowly. And I was in Germany last week for a couple days of talks. And one of the points I made to the Germans there, I said, you know, one of the few things, if you go back, I mean, Mr. Trump has not said a lot of things on foreign policy over the last 30 years. But there are a couple things he said pretty consistently. And one is, his view of alliances, not just NATO, but also alliances with South Korea, with Japan, have invariably been the Americans provide the bulk of the defense and allies free ride. And one of my points was, NATO agreed in Warsaw to each ally would spend 2% of gross domestic product on defense. I think you ought to take this seriously. I mean, that's going to be a measure by which I believe Mr. Trump is going to judge the performance of allies. So I think they understand there's a concern. There are steps now being taken slowly to begin to rebuild the capacity that NATO would want to have, particularly conventional capacity to resist Russian military action. And this shouldn't be hard. I mean, if you take the United States and NATO European countries and combine their gross domestic products, it's about 20 times that of Russia. We ought to be able to afford this. But I think there is going to be some pressure at a minimum from the Trump administration for allies to do more in terms of contributing more in terms of money and weapons to NATO's defense. Yes,
how do you think a no-fly zone in Syria would have played out?
I think it was a workable idea until September of 2015. It would not have been hard for the American military to shoot down Syrian Air Force. Once you had the Russian Air Force flying there, the game changed. And that was one of the things I supported Secretary Clinton, but when she talked about a no-fly zone after September 2015, are you really prepared to shoot down a Russian airplane? And my guess is, at the end of the day, probably not. So I don't see how a no-fly zone works. Possibly, if you wanted to go to a concept which has been mentioned, I think the Turks have talked about it sometimes, a safe zone. If you could carve out a part of Syria where the Russians aren't anywhere near and say, okay, a no-fly zone over that. But you can't do a no-fly zone over all of Syria unless you're prepared to take on the Russian Air Force. And I would not counsel that to the administration. Yeah.
What's our benefit in opposing Assad and aiding the rebels?
I think, there's a benefit to our allies. You've got 1 million plus refugees in Europe now who fled Syria because of what Assad's doing. The chaos there is such that it's going to be hard. I mean, it flows into Iraq. It potentially affects Turkey and other allies. And I think part of it is just the humanitarian question. Are we prepared to sit by and watch somebody like Assad basically kill a couple 100,000 of his own people? Now, I'd step back in this because it's a hard question. Because I think he's a repulsive leader. He deserves to be removed. But are we prepared to put, real skin in the game, which is, American troops, things like that? And I'm not sure I'm prepared to take that step. And my guess is the American people don't want to go to war in that area. So that's one of the problems. I mean, we want to see Assad out, but we're not prepared to make a commitment like the Russians have made to keep Assad in. And so that's where I get back to, I don't think we can have a real conversation with Moscow about Assad until we figure out what we're prepared to do ourselves with regards to Syria. And that'll be an early decision for the Trump administration.
But isn't Assad, the dam that Saddam was in Iraq? Kept out ISIS?
I'm not sure you can say that that's why. I mean, if you look at most of the Syrian army actions and the Russian army actions, they're not against ISIS. They're against groups that we would actually consider more moderate, and I use moderate in quotation marks because these groups are all pretty ugly. But you haven't seen much in terms of real fighting by the Syrians and the Russians against ISIS. They talk about it, but when you actually look where their airstrikes are landing, they're not landing on areas of Syria controlled by ISIS.
What's the Israel-Russia connection? Is there one?
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting because one of the things that happened after the Soviet Union collapsed is Russia, which had for a long time basically only let a trickle of Russian or Soviet Jews leave, Russia said, go. And the number, probably Russian Jews are now maybe a sixth or seventh of the population of Israel. So there's a huge connection there. I mean, it hasn't always translated in the way that Israel would hope, because you still have the Russians being very supportive of Syria and other Arab states. But it's an interesting factor simply because of the huge outflow that took place in the 1990s and that large population which ended up in Israel. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about the relationship between the Russians and the Chinese? I know both fleets are exercising together.
Yeah.
Is that just to tweak us, or is it?
Probably. I mean, I actually, You know, it's been, let's see, I came back, I was a diplomat in residence at Stanford University for the first part of 2001, and I came back to my new job as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia and Ukraine in July of 2001. And Russia and China had just signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation. Is this going to be, you know, a new alliance? And I was actually, and most people look and said, nah, don't get too excited about this. I mean, they're going to rely on tactical questions, but you can't see a strong alliance in large part because the dynamic country is China. And in that alliance, the junior partner would be Russia. And there is no way that the Kremlin's ego could sort of be second fiddle to China. So there's some real limits there. And I'll just give you a couple of other examples. My colleagues who work on China at Brookings, when they go to China and talk to the Chinese, they say, the Chinese, when they talk about Russia, that's kind of, you know, that's where we get our oil and gas, but there's nothing there that interests us. You know, occasionally we buy a fighter plane, then we reverse engineer it, and then we build it ourselves. But you know, it's really seen in very economic terms, and the Chinese are pretty mindful that, you know, they're doing $600 million a year in trade with the United States, and the objective for Russia is at some point to get to 100 billion. So economics is a big factor there. But the other thing that I still think, the Russians are nervous a little bit about China, because there is some cross-border penetration. In 2003, when we were choosing our consul general for our consulate in Vladivostok on the Pacific coast, the fact that he spoke Chinese as well as Russian helped get him the job, because there was a significant Chinese population there. And if you want to see a Russian get nervous, we don't have a map, but if you can imagine a map of Russia, and if you draw a line right about Lake Baikal, and from Lake Baikal in Siberia to the west coast, or the Pacific coast of Russia, that's about 40%, it's mostly Siberia, but it's 40% of the land mass of Russia, and it's full of oil and gas and gold and timber and all kinds of neat things, and not many people. Yeah. It was 7 million people was the estimate in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The estimate is down to about 6 million, because it's a really hard place to live. If you go 100 miles into China along the Russian-Chinese border, there are 140 million Chinese. And every once in a while, you'll see some Chinese academic write about the unequal treaties on which China ceded that space. And the Russians get nervous about that.
I was in that area in 1973. And,
the conflict,
well, I mean, through the Far East, Nukutka, and then Vladivostok and that area. But most of the people, I was on the train, Trans-Siberian, right. And most of the people on the train were all Chinese, you know, or Russian troops, one of the two. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak about specific individuals and their role in the statecraft. And the three I have in mind, just to get your opinion, if you don't mind, would be all the currency that John Kerry and has invested in Sergei Lavrov, and whether that's, you know, obviously they enjoy getting together for dinner and drinks, but has that gotten anywhere? And then another one would be Paul Manafort and his impact maybe as an advisor to Trump in terms of your two scenarios.
Yeah, so Secretary Kerry and no, I admire Secretary Kerry for continuing to try, and you want to keep trying, but I think he probably, you know, went to the well a few many times after it was pretty obvious we weren't going to get there, and at some point you have to just say there's not a basis for a deal, but he certainly tried hard. Also, the problem is Lavrov is not the guy to meet. Lavrov doesn't make decisions. Lavrov executes orders. So the more worthwhile conversations were not the ones that happened in Geneva between Kerry and Lavrov, but the few times that Kerry could go to Moscow and meet with Putin. Didn't get very far there, but again, you know, Putin's the decision maker. Lavrov is, in some ways, you know, a very professional diplomat. I think a diplomat who actually is fairly strongly anti-American in his personal views, but is not really a decision maker. Paul Manafort is I've only met him actually once. And very interesting, this is an American political advisor who went to work for Viktor Yanukovych in about 2006, 2007. Yanukovych was the one who lost in the Orange Revolution and then came back and largely, and I give Manafort a lot of credit, won the presidential election in Ukraine in 2010. And I remember Yanukovych came to Washington at a talk we organized for him at the Center for Strategic International Studies in 2006. Soviet haircut's gone. He's got a nice haircut. The suit fits. And he's learned to do something. Most Ukrainian leaders, when they give a speech, sit there and read the speech. You know, and he'd been given the basic lesson: you look left, you look right, you look center, and you engage the audience. So he'd really been prepared. Now, once he moved away from his speech, which was finely tuned for American ears, I think Manafort had a big hand in the speech, and then got to the questions and answers, the mask kind of came off and you saw the old Yanukovych. So, I mean, I think there was a connection there. What I don't know, and it's curious to me that in the Republican convention, the only plank that apparently, and this was when Manafort was working still for Trump, the only plank that they removed from the party platform was the plank that called for providing lethal military assistance to Ukraine. And it seemed kind of strange for the only thing to remove. So I think Manafort had that Ukraine connection, but you know, I'm not sure if that lingers on after Trump fired him back in September.
I am really sorry to have to bring this discussion to a close, but I have to get Stephen to a class he's got to teach. So let me thank you all again for coming out tonight. This is our last lecture of the semester, but if we have your email and you check our website, you'll see all our events and activities coming again in the spring. So I hope we'll see you back then, if not sooner, for some of our other activities that we have planned. But let me thank our speaker for thanks for coming.
Hey, Ambassador.